Hey everyone, in this one I wanted to go away a little bit from my previous videos where I've concentrated on building an accounts receivable app and just do a demo really of something that's bothered me since the day I first started to use Bubble. So I'm going to show you this and hopefully this will save you a lot of time. There was no other demos about that really show me how to do this, so I'm just doing this in the hope that it will help somebody else as well. So the problem is where you need to save multiple pieces of information at the same time, and in general coding and programming you will do that using loops and iterations and whatever, and that is one thing where Bubble really does fall down, which is it doesn't offer a natural way to do looping and iteration. There are ways you can do it through back-end workflows, but you've got to be on a paid plan for that, and sometimes you just don't want to do that. You just want to do it the natural way that you would want to do it. So that's what we're going to cover in this. Now in this one we're going to be putting in an invoice or lines on an invoice. And it seems such a straightforward thing to have to do. So to save us all time, I've already done the layout here. It's very simple. I'm not getting really complicated in this. I want to show you how to do it. So there's a couple of ways really that you would normally do this type of thing. The way that a lot of people like to do it, and it is quite simple, so I can understand that, which is as you put the lines in here and you would click, say, the plus button to do it. Let me show you the running app actually, it might be easier. Yeah, the way that you would normally do it, you put the information in, click plus, and it would immediately write to the database. And what you would do is then store it in a record that would have some flag on it or something that would say, yeah, this isn't actually part of the main data. So in other words, you can use that flag to query to ignore it when you're running genuine reports, so it just becomes like a draft type of mode on your database. Okay, and that's one way of doing it, and there are benefits to doing it that way. The first one is that you're kind of creating a cache. So in other words, if the browser goes down or you refresh the page, you can bring that information back up to show to the user in that respect. The other thing as well is that you then don't have to do looping or iteration, and also you don't need any plugins to do it. The way that I'm going to do it is to store the information that the user types in memory, in variables, and then write the invoice at the end when they click a save button. Okay, so that's what we're going to do in this demo. Now, like I say, that's not possible because if you can imagine, if you're adding line after line into a list, there's no way to iterate or loop over that list. I mean, and the way you could do it is to sort of limit the number of items or lines that you put on an invoice to say 20 or 50, and then just sort of manually repeat that over and over again. But number one, you immediately put in limitations on your app in that there's a limit to the number of things that you can do, and also it's just absolutely screaming out for bugs. If you need to make a change, you've got to make it in 20 or 50 places. You want to do it the proper way, which is to loop and iterate to do that. So just to let you know, Bubble doesn't do that, so as I said, so we will need a plugin for that. It's a free one, and we're going to go through that in a second. But let's just go through everything from scratch. What we're going to be able to do here, you put the details in, a description, a quantity and a price, you click the plus button and it will add the line in here, okay, but it will only be saving it into memory, which, as you know if you follow my previous videos, mean anything that you store into memory in variables is stored into Bubble's custom states, and then we save it to actually save the record at the end. Okay, so let's get started with this. So the only bit of logic that I've actually built into this at the moment is that the total box has already got an initial content set for that. It's going to be input quantities value times by the prices value, give you the total. So it's just a calculation that just gets there, and I've set it on the initial content, and I've set this input is disabled, so that will always be the content. So that's the only bit of logic that's in there at the moment. So let's have a look. We've got repeating group, obviously, that's got these lines in there. Now, at the moment, there's no data being shown. It is just description, quantity, price. And as you saw from there, there's actually no records being shown anyway. So at the moment, I've got a type of content of invoice line. Now let's have a look at the data before we go into that. So I've got a data type for invoice, and I've got a data type for invoice line. So invoice just has a date, again this draft thing, because I've also built it out using the where we save it into the database, and you usually have like a flag which is draft of either yes or no. The lines that it's stored on the invoice, the number, the invoice number, the total, and it was linked to a transaction which we have somewhere else in the the database, which we're not going to focus on here. And then we've got the invoice line, which has a foreign key back to the invoice that it belongs to, the item, which is the description, the price, the total, quantity, and so on and so forth. So that's where we're going to store the data ultimately. So invoice line seems logical, doesn't it? These are all invoice lines, you would store them. The trouble is we're saving them in memory. So what I originally expected that I would be able to do with Bubble is in the data sources that I could have a custom state, which would be a list of invoice lines, because you can do that. You know, we can have a custom state. So let's say on the page here, remember to add custom states in Bubble is you click this I on any element, doesn't have to be the page, and then we can click add a custom state, and let's say that we call this invoice lines, and you would set that to be invoice line, and you would say yep, it's a list, and you would create that. And then what you'd expect to be able to do here is just to say, okay, it's an invoice line, the data source is going to be the pages I've called it inv just to be short. It's going to be invoice lines, and you'd think that that would do the job, okay? Because what you should be able to do is when I click plus, you'd think, well, what I'll do is I'll just add the details here into an object of invoice line onto this list, and then that will get populated on there. That would be the simple thing to do, and hopefully, you never know, in the future they might allow us to do that. The problem that you've got is simply this. So if I put a workflow on this plus, start edit the workflow, and I said add an action, and by the way, this is not a complaint, by the way, a Bubble is just unbelievably awesome, and the fact that we are workarounds and they allow people to extend it with plugins, just, you know, the fact that you can overcome these things means that there is no dead end, there's no brick walls in Bubble. So there is a limit to the functionality that they give you as a vanilla system, but there are ways to extend it and workarounds, which is fantastic. So let's have a look. So element actions, so you think, well, okay, I'm gonna set a state on this, and the element is the page called inv, and then what I'm going to do, the custom state is going to be invoice lines, okay, or yeah, so invoice lines. So but that's a list. So let's say I'm going to do, I'll create a new state called invoice line instead, and that is just a single invoice line, okay, not a list. So the custom state is this, and then what I should then be able to do is to assign all the properties that they put into the boxes here. And as a second state, once I've done that, I can then say set another state, which is to go to inv, and then I can say the custom state lines, and then I would say inv underscore invoice lines, and then I would say at the bottom here to plus an item, and then that would be the custom state that I've set up. Okay, so in here I'm going to create a new invoice line. I'm then going to add the values from the input description, input price, quantity, and total into there, and then add that item onto this invoice lines, which I've then got on this as a data source on this repeating group to give you the lines that you've got on an invoice. Okay, unfortunately, the problem that you've got with this is that you say custom state invoice line, great, now I'll go and assign the properties. You can't. It doesn't give you the option to do it. So I can't say invoice lines item is this, invoice lines price is this, invoice lines quantity. You just can't do it. Okay, you can't just wrap it up into an object, which would have been ideal, but you just can't do it. Okay, so the way that we're going to need to do it is to actually use individual lists for individual pieces of information, which, if you imagine, that's what you'd be doing anyway, really wrapping it up inside an actual object. It's just that they're kept separate, they're not sort of wrapped up in a nice little box for us. So the way that we do that, then let's remove these, and what we will do is we will set some states, okay, and we can delete the states that we've set up in a moment. So the reason I explained that was just to let you know that that's how you would think you would do it, but that's not how you can do it. So I'm going to show you how you can do it. So we'll just bin these off. Actually, we can delete these, we don't need them. Okay, so let's create a custom state. So we've got description, quantity, price, total, so we need to create a list for each one of those. So let's put underscore description, and that is just a text. It's going to be a list, so we'll create that. Remember that this is when they add a new line, so we're going to assign a value to that, and that is going to be, remember this is a list, so we can't just say put the input description into it. We need to then reference what's already in the list and then add that as an item. So the way that we do that is simply reference itself again from inv underscore description, and then we would say plus item and then input description's value. Cool. Let's do the quantity, set another state. We're going to need to create a new custom state. We will call that underscore quantity, and this one's going to be a number. Okay, and again we do the same thing. We need to reference it back because it's a list. It's not a value that we can just assign. Okay, did I create it as a list? I didn't create it as a list, did I? Right, okay, fair enough. Let's get rid of that. Set another state. Okay, so I'll delete the quantity. I should have set it as a list. Okay, so we're going to create that. So we're going to say underscore quantity. Somebody watching this has spotted that, I know, beforehand. It's a list. Okay, so let's set this up. So invoices, quantity, and then we get list options then, and then we can say plus item, and then we can say input quantities value. Right, now let's do the price one. Custom state, create a custom state underscore price. That's going to be a number as well. Yep, it's a list, and we grab that list and we're going to add the item to it, plus item, and then we reference the input box value. Okay, and finally we're then going to create another custom state, and this is the total. Again, it's going to be a number. Yep, it's a list, and again we're going to reference the list of totals, and then plus an item for the actual input totals value. Okay, and then that then assigns that into those lists, so that we get a list of descriptions, a list of quantity, a list of price, list of totals. They're separate lists, but because we're adding them at the same time, description 1 belongs to price 1, quantity 1, description 10 belongs to quantity 10, price 10. Okay, so they're linked by a common index, if you like, even though they're not linked or wrapped up nicely in an object as we would have liked them to have been. Bubble's telling me we've got an issue. Let me see. Oh, it's saying we haven't got a data list here. We haven't got a data source. So let's clear that expression. Okay, so if we're not going to put in there a list of invoice lines because we can't assign them, then what is the type of content going to be? Because we're going to put a list of descriptions. We want to put a list of description, which is text. A list of quantity is a number. A list of price is a number. We can't, and also the data source can't be just one thing, because there's 4 different elements that we want to actually, 4 pieces of information we want to display. So what do we do here? Because it can't be of type invoice line, and there can't be just one data source on that one. So the way that we get around this, and we have to trick the repeating group, I suppose, not trick it, but manipulate it, if you like, into doing something different. And the way that we do this is quite nice, because this is where plugins come in, is we need to generate a list based on a number. So in other words, whenever we add another item in there, we need to tell the list that actually the number of cells that are in there, the data that it's coming from, is not this data here. It's actually a number. It's actually a list of numbers, if you like, and that way we can set the length of the list and do whatever we want to do. So there's a couple of things that we can do with this. Like I say, we do rely on a plugin. They're free, and I'll just show you that now. So if we go to plugins here on the left, I've got two in here. Toolbox is one and ListShifter is the other one. Now the Toolbox one has a plugin or an element called list of numbers, and we're going to use that first of all to do this, because it's very simple to set up. The ListShifter is something we'll use in a moment, and to add it, all you've got to do is go to add plugins and then do a search for Toolbox. It's completely free. It's one of the most popular plugins. You know, every Bubble developer, when you get past a certain level of complexity, needs to use these type of plugins. Okay, so we'll go back to the design. When you got a plugin, they're usually under these visual elements. So here we've got list of numbers. So I'll just drop this into the main group that I've got. Just keep it pretty small. We'll rename it so it's quite small so we can refer to it. So I'll call it LOM inv lines. Okay, and all we've got to do really is set these up here. So we say, what's the starting number? It's going to be 1. If you're a developer, it's important that everything in Bubble is on the basis of 1. You know, it's not like arrays where in JavaScript or other languages where arrays start from 0. So it starts from 1. It's not 0 based, it's 1 based. So length of the list, we'll come to that in a second. Increment is going to be 1. We only want it to increase by 1 each time. So the length of the list. Now this is where we got to this is where we can reference our list that we've created. So what we can do here is to say we've got the inv, and we can use any one of these, but we're going to just use description. And because it's a list, we get this option here for count. So therefore the length of the list is going to be however many items we've got, and that way, by doing this, we can then, because this creates a list of numbers, I've called it LOM, it's LON, isn't it? LON. N for numbers. What we can do then is we can use this as the data source for our repeating group. So what we can do here is we can say, no, it's not an invoice line that's going to be the type of content, it's going to be a number. And the data source is going to be our list of numbers component, LON, list. Okay, and that way this will show as many different records as we've got in our list of items that we create up here. Right, so if I just show that, what I will do, I've got just some basic details in here. Just say description, quantity, price. There's no data going to be shown, but at least it will give you an idea of the records being shown, just to show that that's actually working. So if we refresh this, and I'll just put some gobbledygook in because it's not going to show the data anyway, and then we click plus, and you can see that we get that in there as well. So we can say blah 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 to okay, and it's just showing you that it's listing an item for every item that we've created in this list in memory using custom states. Okay, so how do we get the data actually to show? Because the data source is a list of numbers, so that's not good. We can't just display the list of numbers. We can't. It's no good adding items and then going 1, 2, 3. You know, even though the data's in the background, we need to bring it into the list and bring it all together. So the way that we do that is fairly straightforward. So let's take this text box here. So we'll click in that and we'll say we're going to insert dynamic data. And what we're going to do is we're going to reference our list of descriptions here, inv description. And what we can do, because it's a list, it gives us the options of a list, and one of those is item number. Okay, so we can say show us the item number, and the item number that we want is the current cell's index. If you've watched any of the previous videos that I've done, when we're doing repeating groups, we sometimes put the header of the repeating group based upon whether the current cell's index is 1. So in other words, it only shows the headers on the very first cell or the very first record or row. So we're using that here as well, current cell's index, and that's why it's important also to make sure that when you're doing the list of numbers that you use a list that's 1 based rather than 0 based, because it's got to coincide with this, and Bubble's repeating groups are always 1 based, not 0 based. So current cell's index, and that will then just show us the description from the the description on the custom states list, and it will show us the description that's in the current sales index. Okay, so if we've got one item and we're showing cell 1, then that'll be index of 1, that'll show us the first one. If it's index of 10, it will show us the 10th item, and so on and so forth. So let's just check that out. Refresh the page, and let's just put some wicked widget, 50 of those at 45, and click that. Okay, you can see that that's taken it there. So we're not clearing these out when we put that in there, so I'll fix that, and then we'll go and do the rest of these fields here. So let's go back here, and on the workflow where the add line is clicked, we'll just set up another action, element action, and reset inputs. And let's do these, and we do these in exactly the same way. Obviously that's referenced the description list, this needs to reference the quantity list. So let's just insert dynamic data, and we will say that it's all of these custom states are on the page in this example. So we can say quantity, and then we will say item number and the current sales index, and then we're just gonna format that as a number with 0 decimal places. Okay, and close that. And the price, the same thing, we reference the price list that we created. So clear that, insert dynamic data, reference the page, and then the price, which is a list. So then we get the option for item number, and then we can say current sales index, and then we're going to format that as a number with 2 decimal places, and so on and so forth. And finally we'll do the total as well. So let's clear that, insert dynamic data, reference the totals list, more, item number, current sales index, and again we'll just format that. Okay, and we're done with that now, so what we can do is then refresh the page. Okay, and we will say super sprocket. We'll have 2 of those at £18.70. £18.70. Okay, and then we can see it's displaying our quantity, our price, and our total. So wicked widget, we'll have 30 of those at 65. Okay, and then we can keep adding, and we can see what we're doing here. So this is storing everything in memory at the moment, a complete list of items. We're not saved anything to the database at the moment, we're just using custom states. And again, this is the way around that you would do it. Okay, I can tell you now, this took me a long time to work out. So my goal is to really help you overcome this step, because there's very little information on this on the forums and all of that type of thing, because most people, the way they're doing it, they're just saving it to the database with a flag on it to say it's not, you know, it's a draft or it's incomplete or whatever. I've never seen a demo showing you how to do this, and it doesn't have to be invoice lines. In one of the previous videos I did invoice payment allocations, where you could allocate invoices to payments, but in that one you could only do it on one, and the reason being is that there was no, I wasn't going to go into showing you how to iterate through allocating multiple invoices to multiple payments and so on and so forth with that, because I was just using vanilla Bubble, and you just can't do looping and iterations in vanilla Bubble. This is just a great example of how you would do this to store everything in memory, invoices, whatever it may be, journals, whatever it may be, and then save it at the end. So let's just let's have another one. Hammer. Okay, and obviously there's no point me keep typing them in, because the save button doesn't work at the moment. We haven't done that, and because we're not saving it to the database, whenever you refresh the page or the app's updated and you refresh, obviously you lose this information. Okay, and that is one of the benefits of doing it where you save it direct to the database, is that data is then able to you can use that as a cache to bring it back, okay? And that's one of the pros of doing it in that respect, and that's why a lot of people will laud that pro. But to me, this is the most natural way of doing it, and you can weigh it up whichever way that you want to do it when you're building your app. We're now going to save these lines to the database, and we're going to need the other plugin that we mentioned before to do this. And the other plugin is the ListShifter. Okay, and that's a plugin from a guy called Keith Crossley, I think, and he's gone to town with this. There's a lot you can do with this. It's not as, we're going to be using it fairly simply. You can use it for a lot more things than that. So ListShifter adds looping iteration features that Bubble mysteriously lacks. Okay, he couldn't be more right when he says this. Now, to my knowledge, this is the only free plugin that allows you to do this. There is other plugins, but people usually charge for those plugins. So this is, I mean, they're not a lot of money, let's be honest, but you do have to be on a paid plan to use a paid plugin. So this is free. He calls it KarmaWare, which means, look, if you're going to use it, there's massive value in there. I want to make it available for free for everybody, but if you're going to use it and you're going to use it in an app in production, play the game and, just do a Patreon thing or make a donation or something like that, okay? But for our purposes, it's free to use. So we've installed it in here. So let's go back to our design, and we can see, just like the other one, we've got this here under our visual element. So we can just drag it in here at the top. Okay, and it sort of creates like a big icon. I'm just going to close that up. Obviously, these are non-visual elements, so you won't be able to see that at runtime, just like you can't with the list of numbers. Right, so okay, so let's have a look at this. We'll just call this LS for ListShifter. We're not actually using the ListShifter element parts of this at all. So really, we could actually just call it Iterator or something like that. Let's stick with LS or something. So LS invlines on there, and we're going to say data type of list, and it's going to be a number. Remember, exactly like we did with the repeating group, we're using it like that. So we're not going to shift any lists. This is all fairly advanced stuff that we don't need. What we're interested in is this, is to get it to generate a numeric list of options. So we're going to say make a numeric list, yes. The number of items, now just like with the other one, we start at 1, we increment by 1, and the number of items is going to be based on how many items in our description list, just like before. So let's set that, and our descriptions list, and we're going to go for count, so that tells it to do that. Now, because we do that and we need to set that to do our iteration, is that does exactly the same thing as our list of numbers does. Okay, so really we now don't need our list of numbers. So what we can do is, first of all, let's change the data source on our repeating group, and let's just set that to, let's just clear this, and we can now just say ListShifter invlines. Okay, and the only difference is that it gives you the option for like shifted list, original list. Just select original list because we're not doing anything to do with shifted lists as such. So it's just the original list that it's created, and the original list is purely just a list of numbers that we're getting it to create in here. Okay, so just let me run that, and just to make sure that does work now that we've replaced the list of numbers. So let's refresh. Okay, and let's go for Super Socket. Make sure that's going to work. Yep, seems to be. Flab flange housing. Okay, yep, seems to be working fine. Okay, so that's all we needed to do. So really we don't need that, and we can, if you didn't want to use that and you wanted to use ListShifter, then we can just delete that. The only reason that I selected to use this in the first place is that it's just a little bit simpler to start off with than having to explain all what the ListShifter is doing. So the ListShifter, really, it's real power. That's great, it generates that, and that's fantastic. but its real power is that it allows you to create custom events and workflows that iterate around the list. So we've got the list, and it allows us to create events around each iteration. So it's essentially the same as looping. That's what it gives us the power to do. So let's see how it does that. So if we go into workflow here, and what we need to do here is, first of all, is to put a workflow on our save button. So we're going to do that. And when they click save, obviously the first thing that we need to do is to actually save the invoice, because we need to save a header record as per our data in here on our invoice type, our invoice table, before we can save the lines. Okay, so let's go back to workflow, and we will say data things, create a new thing, and that's going to be an invoice. Set the fields. So date is just going to be, we'll just set it to the current date and time on bubble. That's fine. And the draft is going to be no. And the total and the lines, now these can be set later on when we know that information, but for now the number is what we need. We need to set a new invoice number. So I'm going to do with this, again, not necessarily how you do it in a production app, but all I'm going to do is to get the last number, the last invoice number used, and add one to it. So how we do that is we need to do a query on the invoices. So we say do a search for and invoice, and there's no constraint, we just want everything. So we can then go back here and say more, and then we can say that the number, and then we can say max, and then we can just put +1. Okay, so whatever the maximum invoice number that's already in the invoice number field, whatever the highest number is, add 1 to it. And that's all we need to do with that for now. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is to actually get it to iterate over our ListShifter in order to iterate over the lines and save the data. So the way that we do that, we can say click here to add an action. And if we go over to our element action, we can see under ListShifter KW. I'm not sure what the W means. I know that K stands for Keith because he's the guy that wrote it. But anyway, so then we need to say, well, what's the action that we need here? And what we do, we use this one here, which is begin iterate a ListShifter. So we select that one. So it selects that because that's the only ListShifter that we've got on the page now. And list to iterate over, don't forget to select the original list. We haven't shifted a list, so you won't get anything. So we've got to select the original list. So select that, okay. Now, the one thing I want to mention here as well, and this is something that's important, is that all that this does is it fires an event, okay. So we can create a separate event that then goes and iterates over the list. So all that we're doing there is saying, right, trigger an event, and then within that event run a workflow. Okay, what it's easy to get mixed up with is if you want to do something like this at the end, once we've iterated over our list and generated all our lines, you think, well, once it's done that, I'll put that here. No, that's not how it works. Basically, it's going to trigger the event and carry on. So you can bet your life that the next step is going to be run way before anything in there effectively finishes. So that's really important to remember. You know, if you use the JavaScript, it's like asynchronous. It's just going to trigger an event, go away and do that in the background, but in the meantime it's just going to carry on. So you can't rely on this being, you can't rely on running actions assuming that that's finished doing what it's doing, because it hasn't. Okay, so what do we do? So we need to click here to add an event. Okay, and on elements we've got these other options for the ListShifter again. So what we need to do there is to say iterate from ListShifter. Okay, so we'll select that, and again it's picked up everything there. Now what we can't do, unfortunately, is pass anything into this because it is an event. ListShifter doesn't include the ability to pass an object or a thing into here. Okay, so we're going to have to do that with custom states, because if we're going to add a line in here as an action for each iteration, which is basically what's happening here, is that this is going to run, this workflow will run for every loop iteration it needs to do. Okay, so but we need reference to the invoice that we just created in here in order to add it to our line. So what we'll do then is before we do begin iterate, we will insert an action. I'm going to set a state and we're going to store the invoice. So the element again is inv. We're storing everything on the page, remember. Okay, we'll create a new custom state and we will call this new invoice, and obviously that's going to be an invoice. So we'll create that, and then we can assign the result of step 1, which is to create a new invoice. So the new invoice we create is then going to get assigned into this particular custom state, and then we can then reference that from in here. So we're going to say click here to add an action. So the action is going to be data things, create a new thing, and this time it's going to be the invoice line, and we're going to set these now. So let's first of all set the invoice. So that can be pulled from our custom state that we just set, new invoice, and now we can set the values. So first one is item, which is the description effectively. Okay, so how do we do this? So we've got access to a custom state with our list of descriptions on there. So again, reference the page and then the description, and similar to we did on the list, we then need to get a particular index to reference that particular position in the list. And the way that we'll do that is we need to get the item number just like we did before, and this time ListShifter gives us the current index of the item that it's iterating over. So what we do is we say this ListShifter current iteration index. Okay, so if we're on the 5th iteration, the current iteration will be 5, so it'll pick the 5th item off the list, and we just do that for every item then. So we can then say the quantity is page quantities item number, this ListShifter's current iteration index. Okay, and the price as well. Price is IMS prices item number, which we get from the ListShifter's current iteration index. And finally we do the total. So the total one is pages totals item number based on this ListShifter's current iteration index, and that's all of our fields assigned, and that's then going to create the line. So we're assigning the invoice and then all the items that we've typed in. Okay, so the next thing that we need to look at is how do we get the total of the invoice, because we need to add that up. So what we'll do is in here we created the invoice, then we're going to set the state, so we'll add a new state, and what we'll do, we'll create a new custom state, and we will say invoice total, and that's going to be a number, and we'll create that. We're going to set that initially to 0 because that's what we want it to be, and then in our iterator we can then add that up. So we create a new line and then we're going to add up the total. So we can say set the state, inv again, and the custom state is going to be invoice total, and that is going to be, we're adding it up, so we need to reference the value that's already in there. So we say ims invoice total plus, and then we can reference the total that's on the current line iteration. So we'll just reference back to the actual list itself, and we can say totals, item numbers, list shifters, current iteration index, and then that will grab the total just like as we did when we were saving the total on the invoice line, and then add it up. Now, like I say, going back to what I mentioned a minute ago, the temptation then would be to go in here and say, right, we've done the iteration now, so therefore we've got our total, so then we'll go update a thing or make changes to a thing to the original invoice and we'll add the total. No, you definitely don't want to do that. We'll go into how you do that in a second. Okay, so we're doing well so far, and that certainly will save the invoice lines and everything like that. The trouble is, if we look in data on the invoice, we've got the lines. We need the lines being stored on there. So all the lines that we generate have to be stored back to the invoice. Okay. Now, again, the temptation might be in the iteration is to actually write that back here. So you create the line, set the states, and then we'll say, okay, now we've created this line, we'll assign that line back to the invoice. But then let's say you got 50 lines on an invoice, you're doing that 50 times. So the best thing to do would just be to, when we added the new invoice line, add it to a custom state list of invoice lines and then assign it at the end, okay, back to the invoice. So what we'll do, we'll need another custom state. I love custom states, as you can probably tell. And we can say the custom state here, we'll create a new one and we'll call it new invoice lines, and we will set the state of that to be invoice line, and it will be a list this time. Okay. Initially, we're just going to leave it there because when you set a state on a custom state and you don't set a value, makes it empty. So there's something there before, it will now be empty. Okay. So when we do the list shifter, what we can do there is on our states that we're setting, we can set another state. If it will do it for me, there we go. And we can say then new, I should have put that in lowercase. Anyway, new invoice lines, and then we can say, we're going to reference it again because we're going to be adding to the list that's already there. So we can say new invoice lines, and we can then go plus item at the bottom. Okay, and then we can say the result of step 1, which was to create a new item line, new invoice line. Okay, so then we just, every iteration, we're then creating a new invoice line, and then we're adding it into a list of lines, which is a custom state that we can assign back to the invoice at the end of the process. Okay, so we've done all of that. Now, like I say, in here, do not add tasks after this that rely on this completing, because it won't complete by the time you do that. It's not synchronous, it's asynchronous. So therefore, what we need to do then, luckily, ListShifter gives us another event that we can use. So if we click to add a new event and we go to elements, it's called a ListShifter iteration complete. So in other words, once the iteration is completed on that ListShifter, then it's going to fire this event, which we can then use to finish off anything we need to do, which is how we're going to write the total and the lines back to the invoice. So we've done that. Let's add the action, and we can say data things, and we say make changes to a thing. And what are we going to change? Well, the thing to change is what we stored on our custom state, which was our new invoice. Okay, just in case you don't remember, that was when we first created the new invoice, and then we assigned it using result of step 1 into our new invoice. So back to our iteration complete. So we're going to set the things to change is what we're going to do with that. We are going to set a total on there, obviously, and again that's going to be the custom state of our invoice total that we added up during the iteration process. So then we're going to change another field, and we're going to say lines. Now lines is a list, it knows it's a list in data. If you look, that lines is a list of invoice lines. So what we can do there is to simply say add list, because this is a new invoice, add list, and then we can say invoice, new invoice lines. So therefore it's going to add all of those lines are, you know, a link to them. It's not actually going to duplicate them. We've already got the lines that are saved. It's a reference to the lines that have been saved, and I'd add them so that when you reference an invoice, all of your lines are on there. And I think that that's it done. I think. Now, before we do this, I just want to give you a word of caution. Okay, let's just update this page. Now, generally speaking, when you're in Bubble and you run your application, you preview it, normally you'll get something like this on the end. Here you go. This debug mode is true. Okay, in question mark debug mode is true. Right. Generally, I'll switch it off because generally it kind of gets it in the way. It makes your app slower, and I only use it if things are going really wrong and I really need to go through it step by step. It's not something that I use sort of all the time. In fact, it's something I use quite rarely. Okay. Now, because iterations and looping are not part of Bubble, okay, for some reason the debugger really gets into a muddle over this iteration thing. So as it's iterating through, the debugger can't trace it, and so what happens is it takes ages to run through, and then it will only ever save 2 iterations of your loop, and then it appears to hang, and it never gets to the point where it runs the complete thing. So all that you need to do is to remove where you get this. Let's have a look. Where you get, sorry, debug. Oh, okay. It's not doing it now. Oh right, okay. It's probably because I've got the / on the end, is it? Debug. No, it's not listing it for me anymore. Okay. But when you get this thing that says debug mode or equals true, before you run it, where you're running the ListShifter, when it's iterating, is take the debugger off. Otherwise, there you go. It's done it now. There you go. Set this question mark debug mode off in there, because it just won't work with the iteration. It really freaks out about it. So you take that off, it works fine. So it works in live mode, you know, it works in test mode without the debugger. It's fine. The debugger really doesn't like you iterating through stuff. So that's just a word of warning there. Okay. So I think we've done everything that we need to do. So let me make sure that I've got no data that I've got quite a bit of data in there. So I'm just going to get rid of all that lot. Before I start, and so we've got a fresh start on this one. Okay, great. So we've got a super sprocket. Okay, and we've got a widget. What, 50 of those at. Okay, and we'll add one more. Oh, I've saved it anyway. Sorry, I didn't mean to save it. I meant to put a new item and I ended up saving it. So I've saved it anyway. Now, okay, so we've got something with 2 lines on there. Okay, so let's have a look. So on our invoice, here's our invoice. We've got invoice number 1. There's our total, and there's our 2 lines that it's stored back on there. We've got the date on there as well. So it has done 2 lines, and then if we go to our invoice lines, there's our 2 lines on there, and again it's attached back to our invoice, which is great. Price, total, and so on, all in there. So it's worked great. I apologise for that. I wanted to add another item in there. We've got our 1 invoice there, so I'll tell you what, let's add another one. So now we're not clearing this out, so I'm going to need to refresh. That's something that probably I do need to do once we do the save. So at the end of the save, even again, probably what we're better off doing is maybe putting it on there, because otherwise it hasn't saved it at this point. So we don't really want to clear things unless it's saved it. So what we can do is to, in here, is to set the state. And what we can do is, let's just tell you what, let's go back to our line. Okay, let's see if we can just copy this rather than do everything again. Set an element. Let's just delete that. Let's paste it in here. Okay, and then what we'll do, we'll just clear the expression so they're blank. Okay, that's it. Saved us a bit of time. Clear the expression of all the lists. Yeah, okay, that's good. Hopefully that will work. It won't work first time, obviously. Let's refresh. Okay. Fantastic. Flipper. Don't ask me. Okay. Super. I don't even know how to. I'm not even. You know, I'm not even going to show my lack of spelling on there. Super delicious pie. Tell you what, we'll have a baker's dozen of those. Okay, and we'll add one more, which is a. We'll have a. I'll tell you what, we'll have another wicked widget. Cool. So we've got 3 items on there. Let's make sure it clears it. Cool, and he did it right as well. Did it at the right time. Great. So let's check our database again. There's our invoice. Again, you can see the number. It's just basically said the maximum is 1, add 1 to it. It gives us 2, 54, 45. We've got our 3 lines listed there, so we've got reference to all of those. And on our invoice lines, yeah, there's our 3, our fantastic flipper and pie and whatever on there. All linked back to the same invoice. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. So, you know, that's how you would do it. That's how you would store your items in memory using custom state lists on the techniques that we've shown, and then just save it using the list shifter, sorry, that will then iterate over. I mean, ListShifter does a lot more, by the way. That we're using it for its most basic of purposes in this, but for this purpose, it works fantastic just to iterate over it. And you can see that all we got is like creating a loop. You know, we just say begin the iteration and then fires an event, and then within that we just run the workflow that we need for each iteration of that, and then anything we need to clean up afterwards we can do using the iteration complete event. So okay, hopefully you found that useful. I spent a long time working this stuff out, so I hope you I hope you get something from it, and it's something that you can use in your own apps. So close this one off, and thanks again for watching. Be back soon with some more videos, and take it easy.